I'm Frank. I'm now 20 years old. Though these days a name feels like a luxury, a relic from a world that went up in smoke a few months back. It all started subtle, a prickle on the back of your neck, whispers on the late-night news. Tensions with the Russians had been simmering for years, a pot kept hot on a low flame. Then, one Tuesday, it boiled over, a nuclear detonation. Now, I find myself camped outside the skeletal remains of Pittsburgh, another city reduced to a graveyard of concrete and steel. Hunger gnaws at my belly, a constant companion. The air here crackles with an unseen tension. Whispers of the Russians still clinging to some semblance of control over these irradiated wastelands are carried on the wind. But I haven't lost hope. Not yet. This is my story. That happened 1 year ago.
A dusty shaft of sunlight, the color of faded gold, sliced through a gaping hole in the corrugated metal roof. It illuminated a face creased with worry, Frank's. He lay huddled inside the makeshift shelter, a hollowed-out concrete block partially buried in the rust-colored earth. The once protective metal roof, twisted and torn, offered scant defense against the harsh elements and the ever-present threat that lurked beyond. A dry cough racked Frank's thin frame. He winced, clutching his side, where a dull ache throbbed. It was a constant reminder of the scuffle with the scavengers 2 days ago. They'd taken most of his meager supplies, the precious water he'd painstakingly collected from a trickling spring miles away, the half-eaten can of irradiated beans that had constituted his last decent meal. He glanced at his meager remaining supplies. A single, crumpled granola bar and a dented canteen half-filled with cloudy water. Hunger gnawed at his stomach, a familiar feeling these days. But it was the vulnerability of his shelter that gnawed at his mind. The storm that had raged the night before had ripped away a significant portion of the roof, leaving him exposed to the elements, and more importantly, to the dangers that roamed the wasteland. He winced again, the pain in his side a sharp reminder of his limitations. Repairing the roof alone was a daunting task. But venturing out into the wasteland, weak and ill-equipped, was an even more dangerous proposition. Frank gritted his teeth. There wasn't much of a choice. Survival, as always, came down to a gamble. Steeling himself against the throbbing ache in his side, Frank pushed himself upright. Dust motes danced in the shaft of sunlight, swirling around him like miniature ghosts. He cast a grim eye around the meager shelter, the vulnerability stark under the harsh light. With a sigh that rattled his chest, he reached for his most prized possession, the faded hazmat suit hanging limply from a makeshift rack. The suit, once a symbol of safety in a bygone era, was now a tattered testament to his struggle for survival. Tears snagged on his calloused fingers as he pulled it on, the worn material whispering tales of countless scrapes and close calls. The helmet, scratched and cloudy, offered a distorted view of the world, a necessary barrier against the ever-present threat of radiation and airborne contaminants. With a final murmur, a prayer whispered under his breath for protection, Frank emerged from the shelter. The familiar, desolate landscape greeted him, a canvas painted in shades of rust and ash. The once proud buildings of Pittsburgh, now mere skeletons of concrete and twisted steel, clawed at the polluted sky. The air hung heavy, thick with the metallic tang of decay and the ever-present threat of unseen dangers. The broken remnants of a billboard jutted from the cracked pavement, its message long faded and peeling. A cruel irony flickered across Frank's mind. A forgotten advertisement for a life that no longer existed. The wind, a restless spirit forever roaming the wasteland, tugged at his tattered clothes, carrying with it the mournful cry of a distant raven, the only sound that dared to break the oppressive silence. Frank stepped out of the mangled shelter, the harsh sunlight momentarily blinding him through the scratched visor of his helmet. A low murmur escaped his lips, a grim mantra for the day. All right then. Just another day in paradise. His voice echoed hollowly in the desolate landscape. He surveyed the wreckage around him. The once vibrant city of Pittsburgh was now a graveyard of concrete and steel, a constant reminder of the world that had been consumed by fire. A shiver ran down his spine, despite the oppressive heat that radiated from the cracked earth. He glanced down at his gaunt frame, the ill-fitting hazmat suit hanging loosely around him. Hunger gnawed at his stomach, a constant companion in this desolate world. Gotta find food, he muttered, his voice barely audible through the filtered mask. Gotta find something to keep going. A glimmer of hope flickered in his eyes as he spotted it in the distance. The skeletal remains of a supermarket, its faded logo barely recognizable. It was a long shot, a gamble on the remnants of a civilization long gone, but it was his only shot. With a resigned sigh, Frank adjusted the straps of his backpack, the meager weight of his remaining supplies a constant reminder of his dwindling resources. He tightened the grip on the makeshift spear in his hand, a crude weapon cobbled together from scrap metal and desperation. He set off towards the abandoned supermarket, his boots crunching on the broken pavement. Each step was a testament to his will to survive, a weary plod against the ever-present threat of this unforgiving world. The journey would be long and arduous, filled with the constant fear of scavenging predators and the lingering after-effects of the apocalypse. Don't know how much longer I can keep this up, he muttered under his breath, more to himself than anyone else. But one day at a time, right? That's all a man can ask for these days. His voice, laced with a weary defiance, echoed across the wasteland, a testament to the human spirit's enduring struggle in the face of oblivion. The once proud entrance of the supermarket was a gaping maw, the automatic doors hanging by a single rusted hinge. Frank approached cautiously, his grip tightening on his makeshift spear. The air hung heavy with the stench of decay and something vaguely sweet, a sickly reminder of spilled food and broken dreams. Damn, he muttered under his breath, pushing aside the shattered remains of a shopping cart. The interior was a chaotic mess, shelves toppled over, cans dented and scattered like discarded toys. Dust motes danced in the feeble light filtering through the grime-coated windows. His heart sank. The aisles, once overflowing with abundance, were now a desolate wasteland of their own. Empty packaging crinkled under his boots, the faded logos mocking reminders of a bygone era. Dejected, Frank pushed deeper into the shadowy interior, his flashlight beam lancing through the gloom. A sudden glint in the darkness made him jump. His breath caught in his throat as he focused his light on a figure slumped against a fallen shelf. A dead survivor, male, his clothes ragged and his face contorted in a silent scream. A pang of fear mingled with a morbid curiosity twisted in Frank's gut. "Oh my God," he whispered, his voice tight. Okay, he's dead. Holy shit, that scared me." He approached cautiously, his eyes scanning for any sign of movement. The body was stiff, rigor mortis having long set in. It looked like the man had been dead for a day, maybe two at most. Frank hesitated, a wave of unease washing over him. Could the body be irradiated? Contamination was a constant threat in the wasteland. He reached into his backpack and pulled out his Geiger counter, a battered device that still coughed to life with a reassuring hum. Holding his breath, he scanned the body. The meter ticked reassuringly, the reading displayed in a dim green glow, 0.29 millisieverts, a low dose. Relief flooded him. It wasn't a safe level, not by a long shot, but it wouldn't be an immediate death sentence either. With a newfound resolve, Frank crouched beside the body. He quickly searched the pockets, his movements practiced and efficient. A glimmer of hope flickered in his eyes when he pulled out a dented but functional flashlight. "Well, that'll come in handy," he murmured, a hint of a smile playing on his lips for the first time that day. He tucked the flashlight into his belt, a small victory in this desolate world. Steeling himself, he continued his exploration of the supermarket, the faint hum of the Geiger counter, a constant reminder of the dangers that lurked in the shadows. The hunt for food continued. The deeper Frank ventured into the supermarket, the denser the darkness became. The feeble light from his scavenged flashlight barely penetrated the layers of dust and grime coating the shelves. He weaved through fallen displays, the rusted metal groaning ominously under his touch. The air grew thicker, the cloying sweetness more pronounced. Frank coughed, the sound echoing hollowly in the cavernous interior. He considered turning back. The meager pickings he'd found so far, a dented can opener and a half-empty roll of duct tape, weren't much of a reward for the risks involved. But the gnawing emptiness in his stomach and the knowledge that his dwindling supplies wouldn't last much longer spurred him onward. Then, a faint sound caught his ear, a soft rustling, barely audible over the steady thrum of his own heartbeat. He froze, his senses on high alert. The sound came from somewhere ahead, a deeper section of the supermarket shrouded in impenetrable darkness. Frank's hand instinctively tightened around the grip of his spear. Was it another scavenger? A feral animal mutated by the radiation? Fear threatened to paralyze him, but the primal urge for survival propelled him forward. He crouched low, the beam of his flashlight cutting a narrow path through the gloom. As he rounded a corner, the source of the sound was revealed. Nestled in a collapsed display case, bathed in the soft glow of his flashlight, were several cans of food, dented and dusty, but seemingly intact. A surge of relief washed over him, so powerful it almost brought him to his knees. He approached cautiously, his eyes scanning the area for any sign of danger. The cans were a variety of soups, his least favorite, but they were food. They were sustenance. He scooped them up, his hands trembling with a mixture of hunger and relief. But nestled amongst the cans, partially obscured by a dented box of cereal, was a glint of metal. With a tentative hand, Frank reached out and pulled out a small, leather-bound notebook. It was surprisingly well preserved, considering its surroundings. Curiosity piqued, Frank flipped open the notebook. The faded ink revealed a series of neatly handwritten entries, dated a few months back. It was a journal, a chronicle of another survivor's struggles in the aftermath of the apocalypse. He scanned the entries, his heart clenching with a mixture of empathy and sorrow. The journal spoke of loss, of desperate journeys, and a relentless struggle for survival. It ended abruptly on a page smeared with a dark stain that could have been blood or spilled ink. The weight of the past, the echoes of another lost soul, settled heavily on Frank's shoulders. He tucked the journal into his backpack, a silent promise to carry the dead survivor's story alongside his own. The scavenged food and the poignant journal, a testament to another's struggle, were meager rewards, but in the desolate world he inhabited, they were a flicker of hope, a reason to keep pushing forward. Frank lay motionless, his body bruised and battered, the aftermath of the explosion still rattling his bones. The air was thick with dust, and every breath felt like inhaling shards of glass. But as he pulled himself up, he forced the pain to the back of his mind. Survival was instinct now, a flame that refused to die, even in the darkest moments. He clenched his fists, feeling the weight of the journal tucked against his chest. The story within it, a stranger's tale of survival, had given him a flicker of hope. But now, it served as a reminder of how easily that hope could be snuffed out. These Russians, with their cold efficiency and brutal tactics, had taken everything from him, again. From his crouched position behind the supermarket's half-destroyed wall, he scanned the landscape. The soldiers were moving away from the crater, content with their brutal display. But as they turned to leave, Frank spotted something. One of them had dropped a small supply pack during the chaos, lying abandoned in the dirt. A new resolve steeled him. If he could get to that pack, he might find something useful. Food, medical supplies, maybe even ammunition. It was a reckless idea, but the Wasteland hadn't left him much to lose. Crouching low, Frank inched forward, eyes trained on the soldiers' backs as they disappeared into the haze. He moved like a shadow, keeping to what little cover remained. Each step was a gamble, every movement a risk, but he knew one thing for certain: he'd never stop fighting. He reached the supply pack, snatched it up, and retreated as quietly as he'd come. Ducking into a crevice behind the supermarket, he tore open the pack. Inside, he found a canteen of water, a half-eaten ration bar, and, to his shock, a single grenade. He stared at it, a bitter smile curling at his lips. Maybe he wasn't as powerless as he thought. Frank gripped the grenade tightly, a plan forming in his mind. He'd make them regret the day they crossed him. This wasn't just survival anymore. It was retribution. With renewed purpose, he crept back toward the wreckage of his shelter, ready to turn the desolate wasteland into his battlefield. The wasteland was unforgiving, but so was he. And he'd ensure the echoes of his fight would reach every corner of this godforsaken land. Frank sat in the dirt, letting out a chuckle that echoed through the barren silence. His heart pounded, adrenaline still coursing through his veins, but somehow he felt lighter. For once, he'd managed to pull one over on the wasteland, on those heavily armed safety enforcers, no less. Sure, he was coated in a film of dust and probably more bruised than he'd been in a while, but in the grand scheme of his apocalyptic existence, this counted as a win. He fished around in his backpack, fingers brushing against the worn leather of the journal he'd found. The stranger's words, scrawled in desperation and hope, flashed through his mind, grounding him in the strange camaraderie that seemed to thread its way through the wasteland, connecting lost souls who would never meet. Rising to his feet with a groan, he surveyed the hazy horizon. It was quiet now, the air humming with the faint, eerie stillness that settled after chaos. The soldiers were long gone, taking their blank stares and trigger-happy antics with them, leaving Frank standing in the remnants of his victory. He felt an odd sense of pride swell in his chest. "Take that, you marshmallow-headed Rambo wannabes," he muttered, brushing off the ash that clung to his tattered jacket. With one last look over his shoulder, Frank trudged forward, a slight limp in his step but a grin on his face. Onward to the next pile of rubble, he murmured with a touch of humor, and may the next group of irradiated idiots be just as dumb. As he walked, the wasteland stretched endlessly ahead, ominous yet strangely inviting. He wasn't sure what awaited him next, but for the first time in a long while, he didn't feel like a solitary survivor stumbling through an endless nightmare. He was Frank, the wasteland's finest smart mouth and grenade dodger, and he was here to make it through another day, even if he had to do it with only a half-busted can opener and a newly acquired pile of canned soup. And if those soldiers, or anyone else, dared to mess with him again, well, he'd just have to show them why the wasteland was no match for a man with nothing left to lose and a little bit of crazy left to spare. As Frank ventured deeper into the ruined city, his footsteps echoed through the hollow remnants of what was once a bustling metropolis. Shadows stretched long across the broken streets, casting jagged shapes that seemed to watch his every move. The tension in the air was thick, each sound amplified in the silence, every faint rustle a possible threat, or maybe a friend. He kept his hand close to his makeshift weapon, a rusted pipe he'd salvaged weeks ago. It wasn't much, but it offered a sliver of comfort. Frank knew that in the wasteland, trust was as scarce as clean water, but the prospect of another voice, a shared fire, a warm body to sit across from pushed him onward. Ahead, he spotted the remnants of an old pharmacy, its faded neon sign flickering weakly as if it, too, were clinging to life. He approached cautiously, peeking inside through the cracked glass. Inside, a ragged figure was hunched over, rummaging through what little remained on the shelves. Frank's breath hitched. This wasn't just another shadow or an illusion born of isolation. This was a real person. The figure turned, catching sight of him, and froze. Their eyes met, both sets wary but carrying a glimmer of mutual recognition. They stayed like that for a beat, sizing each other up in the dim light. Frank raised a hand, showing it empty, a universal sign of peace. "Hey," he said, his voice soft but carrying through the silence. "I'm just looking for a place to rest, not looking for trouble." The stranger regarded him for a moment longer, then nodded, a slow, cautious gesture. They relaxed ever so slightly, still clutching a rusty knife but no longer poised to strike. Frank stepped inside, his muscles tense but his expression calm. The two exchanged a few quiet words, neither giving away too much, both holding tightly to their guarded selves. But in those few moments, an unspoken understanding passed between them. In a world gone mad, where survival meant solitude, they had each found someone who knew what it was like to walk these streets, to sleep with one eye open, to live in the shadow of constant threat. They didn't need to say much. For now, just being there, sharing the same dimly lit pharmacy, was enough. They both settled into the quiet, each taking up a spot by the window, looking out at the deserted streets below. And so, in that abandoned pharmacy, Frank found a brief sanctuary, not just from the cold or the elements, but from the endless stretch of lonely days that had filled his life. In this fragile moment of companionship, he felt the smallest spark of hope, a reminder that even in a world laid to waste, human connection could still be found in the unlikeliest of places. The once bustling city was now a hollowed shell of its former self, a landscape of broken buildings and abandoned dreams. Frank moved carefully along the debris-covered streets, his heart racing with a blend of fear and faint hope. From the cracked and leaning structures, small signs of life began to appear. He approached a small cluster of people, their faces showing both tension and urgency. "Excuse me," Frank asked cautiously. "How are things here? What's going on?" The group glanced at one another, their silence heavy with mistrust and the constant drive to survive. They continued gathering their few belongings, avoiding eye contact with Frank. He swallowed, understanding their hesitance. Trust was scarce in these times. Then he noticed an older man standing a little apart, with weary lines etched into his face. His jacket had a name tag barely holding on. Kowalski. Summoning his courage, Frank stepped over. "Excuse me, sir," Frank said gently. "Do you know what's happening? Why is everyone leaving?" Kowalski gave a rough cough, his voice thin and tired. "We're heading out," he murmured. "People say there's a place, somewhere south, where things might be safer." Frank nodded. The risk of contamination haunted everyone here. "Isn't everywhere dangerous now?" he asked. "There are whispers of places," Kowalski replied softly. "Valleys that escape the worst of it. We're chasing what little hope we have." A sudden, sharp noise cut through the air. The group scattered as a series of gunshots echoed down the street. Frank turned, his heart sinking at what he saw. From a side alley, soldiers emerged, their movements quick and precise. Clad in protective gear, they approached with a chilling intent, rifles raised. One by one, the group of survivors began to flee, but few escaped the onslaught. Kowalski stumbled, gasping. "My daughter," he choked out, clutching his chest. "Lucy." Frank hurried over, filled with a fierce desire to help. "Are you okay? What's wrong?" Kowalski looked up, desperation in his eyes. "Lucy, my daughter's in that building. She was looking for supplies. I told her to stay close." Frank gripped his shoulder in reassurance, though his own nerves were rattling. "Hold on, I'll check." Kowalski pulled a faded photo from his pocket, showing a young woman with a bright smile. "Lucy," he whispered. Frank's gaze shifted to the burning building nearby, now a smoldering ruin from the soldiers' assault. He turned to Kowalski, determination settling over him. "Stay hidden. I'll see if I can find her." Kowalski looked at him with both gratitude and doubt. "Would you do that for a stranger?" "We're all strangers out here," Frank replied, "but we all have something to lose." Without waiting for an answer, Frank sprinted towards the building. weaving through broken walls and avoiding stray shots. His heart pounded as he moved forward, fueled by the small hope he could make a difference. The Wasteland was unforgiving, but some things, like courage and compassion, remained. Smoke billowed from the gaping hole in the building's facade, licking at the sky like a malevolent tongue. Frank, ignoring the searing heat, scrambled through the debris, his boots crunching on broken concrete. Inside, darkness pressed down, suffocating and thick. The last flicker of daylight had died moments ago, leaving only the faint hum of his scavenged flashlight to pierce the gloom. He moved with cautious urgency, dodging fallen beams and twisted metal. The air hung heavy with the stench of burning plastic and something acrid, the telltale scent of explosives. The soldiers must have used a grenade to take out the first floor. He navigated the ruined interior, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. Each creak and groan of the wounded building sent a shiver down his spine. Every shadow seemed to hold a hidden danger. Reaching the foot of the stairs, he froze. The sound of heavy boots echoed down from above. Two soldiers, their presence a suffocating weight in the confined space. Frank flattened himself against the wall, his breath catching in his throat. As they passed, Frank could hear their muffled conversation. Words like, "eliminate the stragglers," and "waste of resources" sent a cold wave of anger coursing through him. These weren't soldiers, they were executioners, purging the wasteland of any remnants of life. He waited until their footsteps faded into the distance, then crept up the stairs, his flashlight beam cutting a narrow path through the darkness. On the second floor, he stumbled upon a sight that froze his blood. There, trapped beneath a fallen beam, was a young woman, Lucy, her face streaked with tears and soot. Her eyes widened in a mixture of terror and relief as the light from Frank's flashlight fell upon her. "Dad!" she cried out, her voice raw with fear. "I'm stuck! I can't get out!" Two figures loomed before her, their faces obscured by the darkness. The glint of their rifles cast an ominous glow. "There you are," one of them snarled, his voice distorted by the filtered mask. "Another useless waste of resources." Lucy recoiled, her pleas for mercy lost in the cavernous room. Frank watched, his blood thundering in his ears. This was it. This was his fight. With a roar, he burst from his hiding place, diving into the nearest soldier. The soldier, caught off guard, stumbled back, his rifle clattering across the floor. Frank used the momentum to deliver a powerful punch to his face, sending him crashing into a nearby desk. The second soldier reacted with a snarl, lunging towards Frank. Frank, fueled by adrenaline and a desperate urge to protect, twisted out of the way. He grabbed the soldier's arm and with a well-placed twist, sent him sprawling across the ruined floor. Reacting instinctively, Frank snatched up the fallen rifle, its weight surprisingly familiar in his hands. He pointed it at the remaining soldier, his finger hovering over the trigger. The soldier looked up at him, surprise giving way to fear in his eyes. A single shot echoed through the room, the deafening report a stark contrast to the silence that followed. The soldier slumped to the floor, his body lifeless. Lucy stared at him, wide-eyed, then a shaky sob escaped her lips. Relief flooded her features. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice trembling. Frank felt a blush creep up his neck. Yeah, he stammered, holstering the rifle awkwardly. "Welcome. Now, let's get out of here. This place isn't safe." His words were barely out of his mouth when a tremor shook the building. Dust rained down from the ceiling, and a large crack snaked across the wall. The building was collapsing. "Lucy," he roared, urgency lacing his voice. "Close your eyes!" Without waiting for a response, he scooped her up in his arms, ignoring the surprised yelp that escaped her lips. The room tilted violently. Bricks and debris rained down around them. Thinking fast, Frank spotted a broken window overlooking the street below. It was their only chance. Taking a deep breath, he propelled himself and Lucy through the jagged opening. The wind whipped past them as they plummeted towards the ground. He braced himself for impact, praying it wouldn't be their last. But then, a soft, yielding mass broke their fall. A discarded mattress, left behind from a long-abandoned apartment, cushioned their landing. They tumbled onto the ground in a heap, the air knocked from their lungs. Frank lay there for a moment, his body aching but alive. He looked up at Lucy, who was coughing but otherwise unharmed. Relief washed over him, a wave so powerful it threatened to bring him to his knees. "You okay?" he rasped out, a smile spreading across his face. Dazed but alive, Frank lay sprawled on the ground next to Lucy. The rush of adrenaline had faded, leaving behind a dull ache in every muscle. He coughed, his throat raw from the dust still lingering in the air. "You okay, bro?" Lucy's voice was a shaky whisper, her expression a mixture of shock and relief. Frank cracked a weak smile, ignoring the sting it sent through his body. "Yeah, I'm all right," he replied hoarsely. "We're alive. That's what counts." Lucy's eyes softened with gratitude, and in a burst of emotion, she threw her arms around him in a tight hug. Frank, surprised, felt warmth spread through him in this bleak landscape. As they pulled apart, he looked at her, his gaze sincere. "You okay, Lucy?" She blinked, taken aback. "Wait, how do you know my name?" A small, knowing smile flickered on Frank's face. "Your dad, Kowalski, sent me to find you," he explained, just as a figure emerged from the cloud of dust and smoke behind them. It was Kowalski, his face streaked with soot and tears, relief brightening his weary eyes. "Lucy," he choked out, stumbling forward with arms outstretched. Lucy's face lit up, a broken smile breaking through her grief. "Dad!" she cried, rushing toward him. But the reunion was heartbreakingly short. A single shot rang out, sharp and final. The bullet pierced Kowalski's chest, and he staggered, collapsing to the ground. Blood seeped from the wound as he clutched his chest, his face twisted in shock and pain. "Dad!" Lucy's scream echoed through the desolate cityscape, her voice raw with anguish. She dropped to her knees beside him, her hands trembling as she held his shoulders, trying to steady him. Frank's heart thundered in his chest as he turned, his eyes narrowing at the figure emerging from the haze. A soldier, his rifle still aimed, advanced with calm, practiced steps. His face was obscured by the mask, his stance cold and unfeeling. "Drop any weapons," the soldier barked, his voice distorted by the filter, making him sound inhuman. Frank glanced at Lucy, her shoulders shaking with sobs as she held her father's lifeless body. Unarmed and facing this cold-hearted soldier, he felt trapped, but surrender wasn't an option. With a swift motion, he pulled a smoke grenade from his jacket, one he'd scavenged from a fallen outpost days ago. He tossed it to the ground, and it exploded in a cloud of thick smoke, engulfing them in seconds. The soldier cursed, momentarily blinded and coughing. Frank seized the moment, grabbing Lucy's hand. "We have to go! Now!" he shouted, pulling her up as she wiped the tears from her face, her eyes hollow yet fierce. Together, they sprinted through the smoke-filled streets, their surroundings a blur of crumbling walls and twisted metal. Behind them, the soldier's frustrated shout echoed, blending with the wind as they pushed toward the edge of the ruined city. They ran until the desolation of the city gave way to the barren edge of a forest, the skeletal trees casting long shadows in the dying light. Frank's lungs burned with every breath, his legs felt like lead, but he didn't stop. He couldn't stop, not now, not with Lucy's safety in his hands. Once they'd plunged into the woods, the trees around them provided a thin cover, branches stretched out like bony fingers clawing at the smoky sky. They leaned against a tree, gasping for breath, surrounded by an eerie, unsettling quiet. Back in the city, the soldier scanned the tree line, his gaze sharp and calculating. He lingered a moment, muttering a frustrated curse under his breath. Then, without a second glance, he turned and walked back into the ruins, a lone enforcer in a wasteland steeped in loss. In the forest, Lucy clutched her father's photo, her tears drying as resolve replaced her grief. Frank looked over at her, his gaze steady. They had survived one battle, but both knew that survival would remain an unforgiving test. And even amidst the ruins, they had a flicker of hope left to carry forward. The forest, once vibrant and teeming with life, now mirrored the wasteland's desolation. Skeletal trees, their bare branches creaking in the dry wind, stretched out like bony fingers clawing at the hazy sky. Frank and Lucy finally stumbled to a halt, collapsing beneath the meager shade of a half-dead tree. Exhaustion clung to them like a shroud as they caught their breath, their hearts pounding in the oppressive silence. Frank hesitated before speaking, his voice barely more than a whisper. "I'm so sorry about your dad, Lucy." Lucy's face was streaked with dirt and dried tears, lines of grief etched into her expression. She shook her head slowly. "It's not your fault," she replied in a hoarse voice. "You saved my life. Thank you, Frank." A faint smile touched her lips, a fragile light amid her sorrow. It tugged at something deep in Frank, a spark of warmth that felt foreign in this bleak world. She tilted her head, her gaze curious. "Frank, I just realized. What's your full name?" "Frank Jones," he answered, offering a small, shy smile. Lucy's eyes brightened with a playful glimmer. "Mind if I call you Frank, bro?" Frank felt a faint blush creep up his neck. Sure," he stammered, looking away. A chuckle escaped Lucy, a soft sound that lifted some of the gloom. "We're probably the same age," she mused. "How old are you, Frank?" 20, he replied, surprised at how young he felt in this harsh world. "Wow, me too," she exclaimed, her eyes widening. "Practically the same age, almost like best friends." Frank managed a smile, something rare for him. "Seems that way," he agreed, the weight of loneliness easing a little with Lucy beside him. He reached into his bag and pulled out the photograph Kowalski had given him, a faded picture of a young Lucy and her father, smiling together. "Here," he said softly, handing her the photo. Lucy's eyes filled with fresh tears as she took the picture, her fingers tracing the outlines of her younger self and her father. "This was us, back when things were okay," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I can't believe he kept this all this time." Frank nodded, a lump in his throat as he shared a moment of silent remembrance with her. After a few moments, Lucy's gaze shifted to his outfit. She raised an eyebrow, a hint of humor breaking through her sadness. "So, what's with the weird yellow suit, Frank bro? It looks like it could double as a neon raincoat." Frank chuckled, glancing down at his makeshift attire. "It's a hazmat suit," he explained. "Keeps me safe from the radiation." Lucy's expression grew thoughtful. "Radiation? But I don't have anything like that." Frank's face grew serious. "We'll need to find you one. There should be some abandoned towns nearby, maybe some supplies left behind." Lucy's eyes filled with a new glint of hope. Maybe, just maybe, they could survive this wasteland, together.